Last time we had class, we started talking about some math operations in Python, including addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, floored division, exponent, and the mod. So most of these you should be familiar with, but just remember that floored division just meant that it rounded down or it cut off the decimal point. So you might want to add that to your notes just so you have it. So for floored division, we could write this will cut off any decimal points, okay? Sorry, this will cut off anything after the decimal point, okay? So it will round it down. So if you had like 2.5, it would become 2, all right? And then we also did some examples, which you should also have. So if you don't have this, just pause the video and make sure you have it. But last time I may or may not have mentioned that all these operations follow the same order of operations as the one we study in math, but in Python it's not called the order of operations, it's called precedence. So let's write that down in case we don't have it. Math operators in Python follow the same order of operations that we use in math. However, in Python, it is called the precedence of math operators. Okay, and just a quick review. You may have this already, but remember it's parentheses first, then exponents. Then we've got multiplication, division, including floored division, and also modulus, which is the remainder. Then we have, remember that the multiplication, division, floored division, and mod, that goes from left to right. And then addition and subtraction from left to right. Okay? So whenever you're evaluating like a mathematical expression, you have to be aware of the order of things. Do things that are in parentheses first and then follow the order. Okay? So I'll give you guys an example. Here's what I want to do. Evaluate the expression 5 minus 1 times 7 plus 1, divided by 3 minus 1. Okay, so take a look at this expression. So the first thing you're going to do is evaluate everything that's in the parentheses. So this outside is going to become 4. So let me see if I can write it in a way that you guys can keep track of it. So this will be 4. Keeps putting a period. Times. Then, if you notice, there's this big parentheses, and inside the big parentheses we have two smaller addition and subtraction, and then the division between them. So first we're going to do the 7 plus 1, which is 8, and then we're going to divide, putting it so you could see where I'm getting these numbers, just making it a little bit easier to see. Okay, and then we have 3 minus 1, which is 2. Okay, so we just did everything that's in the parentheses so far. Okay, now before you multiply, you're going to have to do what's inside the parentheses, which is 8 divided by 2, so that should give us 4. Okay, and then finally you would do 4 times 4, which should give us 16. And we could check this answer by just printing to the screen. I'm going to take that whole expression actually, and I'm going to copy and paste it inside the print. And if I run this, I should get 16. So let's try it. Okay, so if you take a look at the bottom, when I ran this, it used the order of operations, and then I got 16. Okay, so that was just kind of an example to show you how Python uses the order of operations, or the precedence of operations, in order to evaluate an expression. Okay, so let's comment this out. Keep pressing the wrong thing. Okay. All right, moving on. We'll practice more with the order of operations as we continue with Python, but I want to move on to data types. Okay. So in math, whenever we create a variable, that variable usually holds numerical information. So, you know, x equals 5, for example. So let's write that down. So in math, a variable usually holds numerical values. For example, x equals 5, x equals negative 2.3, okay, and so on. Now, in computer science, a variable doesn't just hold numerical values. It can hold different kinds of values. Okay, and those different kinds of values are called data types. So let's add that in. Those different types of values, or maybe kinds of values, are called data types. Okay, so let's talk about the major data types in Python. Okay, one, we have integers. And so a variable can hold integers. So this is whole numbers, both positive and negative. So like examples would be -2, -600, 5, 0, 2000. You get the idea. So those are integers. So a variable can have an integer value. Another piece of information that a variable can hold is called a float. Now, that sounds a little bit weird, but all a float really is in computer science is it's a decimal, but it's called a float. Okay, so this is pretty self-explanatory, but basically a float is a separate category from integers. So integers don't include any decimals, and floats only include decimals. So what I mean by that is we could have maybe, you know, 3.14, which is pi, so that's a decimal. We could have -1.25, and also, very important, something like 1.0. Now, it doesn't really have values in its decimal portion because 1.0 is just 1, but it's considered a float because of the 0.0. So the way that Python, or the computer, reads that is that 1.0 is a decimal rather than an integer. So that's something that you should keep in mind while working with values, is that even though it's 0.0 and there's no value there in the decimal portion, this is still considered a float in Python. Okay, moving on. We have strings. And strings is basically any characters, letters, or punctuation. Okay, so hello in quotes would be a string. A bunch of letters in quotes would be a string. You could have exclamation points with a bunch of letters and numbers in quotes. You could also have 3.114 in quotes. Okay, Now, that's interesting because you might say, well, wait, 3.14 is a float. However, when I put it in quotes, that means that the computer is not going to interpret it as a number. It's going to interpret it as just a bunch of characters because the computer doesn't know any better. So you might see this as 3.14, but the computer will read it as a string. So the computer will not be able to do any math on it. So let me add that in. Keep in mind that strings that look like numbers are not numbers, which means Python cannot do any math with them. So let me show you what I mean. So if I get out of my comment, if I do this 3.14 and I print it out, so actually never mind, I'll show you this later. But yeah, all I want you to remember is that if you are using a string and it looks like a number but it's in double quotes, it's not actually a number and Python cannot do any math with it. Okay, so keep that in mind. We're going to add one more data type, and the fourth one is going to be called a Boolean. And a Boolean is actually a true or false value. Okay, and we'll learn more about Booleans later on, but a true value in computers is 1, and a false value in computers is 0. So 1 usually represents true and 0 usually represents false. So a Boolean data type has just one of two values, either true or false or 1 or 0, nothing else. Okay? All right, very good. So those are the data types. So what does all of this mean? Well, it just means that if you have a variable, you can set it equal to a value, and that value can be anything from these categories. It could be an integer, a float, a string, a Boolean. There are other data types that we will talk about later on, but these are the major ones. So there are more data types that we will cover later on in class. Okay? But 1 through 4 are the most important and useful ones for basic programming. Okay? All right, very good. Okay. Just trying to see if I can pause the video. Okay. Keep in mind, guys, that since this is a video that's pre-recorded, you can definitely pause it, rewind, make sure you get all the notes down. You know, I'm trying out this thing of recording the videos beforehand to see how it works out, if we like it better or if we prefer the live version. We'll see what happens, but the good thing about this is that you can pause and rewind, so definitely make use out of it. Okay. So we're going to talk about string concatenation next, and replication. Okay, so let's talk about what concatenation means first. So there's a lot of vocab you have to know, as you can see. So it's all vocab that's associated with programming. So it might seem like a lot right now, but you'll get the hang of it when we keep using these things, and I'll keep referring to them by their correct names. So concatenation just means combining things together. So concatenation is combining things together. So let me show you an example of concatenation. So concatenating two strings. So let's concatenate two strings. So here's what I want to do. Okay, So let's say I'm printing John, okay? And also, actually, going back to concatenation, I want to also type in Python, use plus to concatenate. All right? So let's say I do John in quotes. So this is a string. And I add Smith also in quotes. And I'm going to run this and see what happens. Okay? Let's take a look. So I'm going to run it. Okay? And take a look at the output. It does John Smith. So it actually joined them together. Going back to the definition of concatenation, I'm going to say combining or joining things together. So that's basically what the plus sign did with my two strings, is that it combined them together. Now, notice that it doesn't know that John and Smith are two separate things, that John is the first name and Smith is the last name. So Python, this is just a computer, and it's not going to know that you meant to put a space between these two. So you have to be aware of your spacing when you're concatenating. So let's add that in. You have to be aware of spacing when you concatenate things. So what I mean by that is it's just going to do John and literally add Smith right next to it because you didn't tell it that you wanted a space. So what you could do is you could do something like this. You could say, okay, John plus, here's a space, plus, here's Smith. So what happens is, here's my space right here. So if I run this, now I have John space Smith. But this is honestly extra work. What you could have done is this. You could have done John plus Smith, and then you could have put the space after John. So if I ran this, I'm going to get John space Smith because this space is right here. It's after John. Or similarly, I could have done John, no space, plus I could put the space before Smith, like this. So if I run this, I still get John space Smith, okay? So you have flexibility with spacing, okay? So let's add that in. When joining strings together that require spaces, you have flexibility with in regards to where you can or should put the space. Okay? What I mean by that is I could have put it after John or before Smith, and I would have gotten that space between the two words anyway. All right? Hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's try concatenating two different data types. So what if I do this? Print John is, now I want a space after is, so watch, I'm going to put my space here. And I'm going to concatenate 15, as in John is 15, like 15 years old. Alright, so if I try to run this, I'm going to get an error. And if you read the error, you'll see that it says type error must be str, not int. So think about this. This first piece is a string. The second piece is an integer. And so what's going to happen is Python doesn't like that. Python does not like when you try to concatenate things that are different types. And so it's not going to be okay with this. Now, the way I would fix this is pretty easy. Instead of trying to concatenate 15, which is an integer, I'm just going to turn it into a string. And if I run this, it should be fine. So look, John is 15. So we need to add this in. Very important. So I'm going to put 3 stars next to it. In Python, you cannot concatenate different data types. So when you're concatenating, everything that you're concatenating has to be the same data type. And so you're not going to be able to concatenate two different data types. So here, when I turned my 15 from an integer to a string, it was fine. All right, I'm going to save this just in case. We're going to be able to concatenate things that are different data types later on when we do something called typecasting, but you don't have to worry about that just now. Okay? So surprisingly, you could also do something like the following. I'm going to comment this out. So Python does something weird when you do something like this. Let's say, Michael, and you multiply Michael by 5. You would think that you would get an error here, but actually you don't. If I run this, let's see what happens. Look at what happens. Michael, 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 5 times. Okay? So let's put a comment here to say what this does. This will print the string 5 times. Now, if I change the 5 to 10, it's going to print it 10 times. Okay? Now, notice that there are no spaces between all the Michaels because Python doesn't know that it's separate words. So what you could do if you want them to be separated is add the space after Michael, and that should be fine. When I run this, there is space between all the Michaels, or I could actually also put the space in front, and I run this and I still get my spacing, except in this scenario it puts the that space in front of Michael too, in front of the first Michael, so that might not be the best way to do it. So you might want to keep the space after. And now it's going to print Michael with the space 5 times. Okay? What you can't do, however, is this. Let's say I do print John in quotes, and I try to multiply that by 5.0. If I try to run this, it's not going to be happy. So you can use the multiplication thing with a string if you're multiplying by an integer. Okay, so let's write that down. This will print the string 5 times, but you must multiply by an integer. Okay, so the 5 here has to be an integer. You can't use a decimal, it doesn't like that. Even if the decimal 5.0 means the same thing as 5, technically, the computer gets lost. This is specific to Python though, by the way, so just letting you guys know. Okay? Alright, I'm gonna stop right here because that was a lot of new stuff. So once you're done watching, make sure you have written all these notes down. Like I said, feel free to rewind, pause, do whatever you need to do to make sure you have all these notes down. If you have any major questions, please let me know. I want to make sure that everybody's caught up, at least with the notes, and is able to run their program when they're trying these out.